Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to another episode of your favorite show, Friday Drinks, wherever you are watching us from. Thank you very much for following us. Today, we're almost near the 4,000 subscribers milestone. Ranga, well done.
Yeah, well done to all of us. It's for a show that we are trying to grow organically. That's not a small number.
Yeah.
So it's a good job for the talent, as Rufaro always want to call it, but also the crew and everyone who is involved in this project.
Yeah, we really do appreciate your support. So please share, subscribe, and like that button. And today is a special occasion. We got some tea from Japan, Oi Ocha. So, I hope that you'll enjoy this. I've had this tea before, and I'm looking forward to it. So, Oi Ocha.
Thank you. I don't know if you say thank you in Japanese, but thank you.
That's
so
good
much.
enough. I think you're gonna enjoy it.
I'm looking forward to
this wrapper looks awfully familiar. I just can't put my finger on it. What it reminds me of exactly, that this wrapper with your Japanese tea, but it looks much more interesting than what you normally hear.
Well, we're looking forward to it.
I do. Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Tinashe.
You're most welcome.
Yeah, this is something different from what I was intending to have on the show.
Well, I got you guys, today is International Beer Day. And I actually got you guys non-alcoholic beer, which you expressed absolutely no interest in drinking. And you chose instead to go with this interestingly packaged
Would you blame us?
tea. But in the end, I was actually quite chuffed that you were adamant on going your way, because what's good for the goose is good for the gander. So one day it will be International Tea Day, or I don't know, International Soft Drink Day on the show, and I will not be under any obligation to follow suit.
It's not like we're ever going to insist on you drinking our tea.
No, Ranga's tried to insist on an alcohol-free show. And obviously,
Really, Ranga?
Yeah.
And obviously failed miserably. So now.
So remember, Rufaro has got this tradition of his where every the first 30 days of the year is off the sauce.
Yes.
And I was making the case that him and George, since they were off the sauce, I think they should have gone all the way and drank some tea. And this guy's insisted on bringing 0% alcoholic drink or something like that. It didn't make sense.
Yeah, that's trolling. It's called trolling.
No, it's not called trolling. It's just called being ourselves. The fact that it was non-alcoholic meant that it was a soft drink, effectively. I don't know what, but it still managed to offend the producer's sensibilities. Anyway, I actually appreciate that it's International Beer Day.
Okay.
So
what are you having?
I, as always, I have the most interesting drink on the table. I have, I'm drinking Castle Milk Stout, which is African. It's black. It's strong. It's beautiful. It's full of character and flavor.
Is it still about beer? Because you're going all poetic. But yeah, I think I must commend you for the way you handled the show last week.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely. It was also good to hear a Mandy man's voice, on the show. I was quite worried that without my voice,
my gosh,
how are you gonna squeaky voice on the show?
Exactly. And for the first time, there was someone that actually managed to outshine Faro in terms of the beer, the whiskey,
the etiquette,
and
in whiskey drinking.
Yeah.
What do you say?
No, it's called being a good host.
All right.
You always make the guest shine.
Yeah. Well, we learned a thing or two.
I hope
whiskey etiquette.
I hope you did, and one day, I hope it nudges you in the direction of consuming wise waters.
Never, but anyway, we have gone Japanese, and we're gonna enjoy our Japanese Oi Ocha.
Well, cheers.
Cheers. Okay, so today's an interesting one because it is the season. It's a new month, and we have elections coming along, I think on the 23rd of August. And we thought, let's have a special where we go down the rabbit hole, anecdotes, data, facts, everything. Let's put it in the ring. But let's talk about political economy. Let's talk about democracy and elections. Is that a necessary and sufficient condition for economic development? I think this is something that we always argue and debate about. And I thought that the audience would benefit from the debates and the arguments we usually have on this particular show, and that's why we started having this show, is because these are debates that we have, at dinner tables and bars, different bars, and we've had these debates for a very long time.
Sure.
So we might as well just broadcast them, and you might benefit from it. I don't know. And then the second half of the show, we're just going to discuss the risk reward of investing in Zimbabwe. We've been canvassing a lot of your information and tidbits around investing in Zimbabwe, and a number of issues have come up, and we think it's just necessary for us to deal with those issues, especially if we want to make Zimbabwe a good place for people to invest in. This is diaspora as well as FDI and domestic investors. So that's really what we're going to touch on. And I know, Rufaro, you are very passionate about democracy and economic development. So I think let's start there. To those who are worried, the reason why I'm wearing this particular t-shirt actually, it's because I think it's quite necessary for us to discuss free markets, and the Mises Institute has a thing or two to say about democracy or liberty and economic development. So that's the reason why I am wearing this particular t-shirt.
Okay, so nothing went wrong in your laundry operations?
Not at all. That never happens. Okay. So, Rufaro, let's start with you. Democracy and economic development. What do you think?
Look, I don't know whether it's correct to say your character. I agree with your characterization that this is something that I'm very passionate about. But I do have a view. I do think that often there's this narrative that strong economic growth is not possible outside of a democratic framework. And I think that's, often, in this part of the world, that's taken for granted that, you need a democratic framework to enjoy robust economic growth. But the historical record tells us a different story. Okay, so in the modern era, if you think about 1981 to 2011, where China experienced GDP growth of above 10% for 30 years in a row consecutively, lifting 600 million people out of abject poverty. That happened outside a democratic framework. China does not pretend to be a democracy by any stretch of the imagination. The Chinese Communist Party runs that country with an iron fist. It's an autocracy, and yet we talk about Chinese economic development over the last 30, 40 years as a miracle, right? So that's probably the most vivid example that captures people's imagination of this amazing economic growth story that happened outside a democratic framework. And then now, if we go further back in history,
could we just interrogate China, for example?
Yeah, sure.
Because I think that you're coming up with your own facts here, as far as China is concerned. So I think let's be clear that when you look at GDP per capita, China is middle income.
Yes, it is.
So it hasn't really fully developed.
So it's not a rich country.
It's not
on a per capita basis, but for sure. But it lifted 600 million people out of abject poverty. It's got world-class infrastructure.
I think
those are facts as well. Are they not?
Yeah. But then let's be clear that its GDP per capita, it still has a long way to go. In fact, it must grow its GDP per capita by about maybe 5 times to be equal to what the US or what rich nations.
Yes. So look.
So let's be very clear that it's on a path.
Yes.
Right. It's still on a path. We can't use it as an example. But even if we were to use it as an example, do you think that China could have done better if it was a democratic state? So there's no one who disputes the argument that economic development or an economy can develop under an illiberal regime. But the argument is, what is the opportunity cost? Is it possible
the counterfactual?
Is it possible that if China was a democratic, open state, that perhaps it would be the richest country in the world by miles?
I'll concede that point. I think they would definitely have done better. I think a liberal democracy would not have made the mistake of the one-child policy, which they adopted. And I think that's held them back in terms of growth, as well as a bunch of other things associated with decisions that were made because you had one party that wasn't challenged, because you didn't have a completely full-throttled free market system. So definitely they left money on the table by not being a full-throttled free market economy. But so I'm not making the case that the Chinese model is ideal. I'm just making the case that they lifted a whole bunch of their population.
Our hypothesis, Rufaro, is very simple and straightforward. Maybe let me go to Ranga and you can help us. Our hypothesis is simple and straightforward. Is democracy necessary and sufficient condition for economic development?
I would say no.
Okay, go ahead.
I would say I think every society must have an opportunity to choose the way they want to govern themselves and to be governed. And when you do that, you have to stay consistent to whatever form of governance that you choose, as opposed to maybe adopting something that's foreign that you don't believe in, and maybe you're just doing it for to please whoever out there, but internally you don't feel that this is the route you want to take. So I think different societies must be allowed to pick a system that works for them. And for me, I think the key is actually consistency. Be predictable. That people have to know that these people, they don't even subscribe to any democratic
Ranga,
principles.
you're skirting around the issue. The hypothesis is very simple and straightforward. Is democracy necessary? Okay, so can you give us an example, historically or contemporary, where you have an illiberal society that has developed?
I think the way I would look at it is maybe not give you an example of that, but look at the number of societies or countries that are struggling with democracy. Maybe they bought the idea that it's good to have a government by the people, for the people, where you've got elected officials that are representing the power base of the electorate. But how many countries that purpose to be democratic out there are really failing to hold on to the principles of democracy? And why is it the case? If we have got evidence of such countries, is it not the right thing maybe to interrogate and say, is there any other model that could possibly work, and then allow these people to stay consistent to what they believe in? Maybe we actually started deep into the issues. Maybe wanted to have you define what democracy is, because I think what we are having in this in this part of the world is we are saying as long as we've got elections every specific number of years, then we are a democratic country. Even if you've got elections that are maybe we are failing to meet all the critical factors of what constitutes a proper election in a democratic society. We are just saying as long as the kind of difference that you see is you've got on one end you have got people who totally don't believe in having elected officials. So they've got a system, whether it's a monarchy or it's maybe a democracy by a few, because I think even in China they've got a system of grooming their leaders and elevating them, and everyone on the ground will have to take that as given. But then you've got the extreme where we have got elections every say 4 or 5 years, and the elected officials they represent the political aspirations and views of the people. But then you've got countries that have got elections that, every year the elections are not really being held in terms of what you'd expect in a democratic society. Why would you continue pushing those countries towards democracy? Okay. It doesn't work for them.
All right. Okay. I think you make very good points in us defining, which I will. But I think in terms of the facts, we've got a very nice table where we look at the top 25 poorest countries in the world and the top 25 richest countries in the world, right? And one distinguishing factor between those two is the one group is democratic and the other is not. So even before we get into what is the shining example of what democracy is, what is very clear is you have one group, the richest countries in the world. What defines them, notwithstanding the capitalism, and capitalism could work under democracy or under dictatorship. They call it the Pinochet model, right? Where you have a tyrant, but who believes in market reforms. But I think to define, and I think that's a very good point on what democracy is. The democracy that we want to discuss is the ability of a society to choose its political leaders through an electoral process. So that is by vote, one man, one vote. So that's a critical element of democracy.
Isn't that a romantic version of democracy, though?
First, let's define. So almost everything is romantic, if you think about it. The idea of the Enlightenment, of which democracy is a critical component of the philosophy of that time, it's romantic. And romantic is not the way you are looking at it. Romantic means it's an ideal. It's an ideal that we must espouse. That we do not get to the ideal does not necessarily or does not negate the ideal. The ideal is still real. So one critical component of democracy is the ability to choose your leaders. Now, if you think about it, how it connects to the market system is the ability of choice, that society must have choice. So how they choose their leaders is critical in the social contract. But democracy goes beyond just voting. You do have systems like the American systems where it's democratic, but it's under a republic. And the republic is to protect certain values or certain basic tenets of a society, the most vulnerable, the rights in a particular society. So it's more than just the electoral process, but it's also the protection of rights of the people, right? So certain guaranteed rights. And here we're now talking about the constitutional rights. And I think you would understand that and you would talk more into that it's more than just the voting, but it's rights that are embedded in the social contract between the citizens and its leaders and how they choose to construct or deconstruct their society. So basic rights.
Are you going to marry this to economics?
Oh, yeah, no, absolutely. Remember, first we're talking about the
definition of democracy. Yeah.
So democracy has those particular rights. And then the third element are the institutions that then embed that democracy. So we talked about the ability to vote your leaders, the ability to protect basic minimum human rights and extend those rights to economic rights, for example. But the third element is the institutions that are important in the governance of democratic society. And those institutions, really, we're talking about the separation of government. And this is where we talk about
separation of power, basically.
Power, yes.
An independent judiciary, a legislature that stands apart from the executive, that sort of thing.
Absolutely. And that separation of power ensures that no one in society has absolute power. And I think that's how it links to the market system, because the market system believes that almost everybody has the right, has the same rights as everybody else in the market, and that there are no barriers to entry and exit. And the central tenet of a free market society is the ability to choose. So you cannot have an ability to choose in the marketplace if you don't have those certain tenets. So, for example, if the judiciary is captured, then your ability to choose is negated. And I think that's why a lot of society, free market capitalism has been tied to democracy. And that's why, for the longest, since the beginning of time, human history as we know it, 6,000 years ago, I know you might differ with that, but I think
are you talking about human history or civilization?
That's why I said you might differ with that.
Are you
but
a young Earth creationist?
No, I think the history that we can, the recorded history of human society,
Okay.
right? That we can.
Okay, since writing about 5,000-6,000 years ago. Okay, yeah, that's fine.
You can agree with that. Huh?
We can
right.
agree.
So if we think about it, why is it society since then? It's not like they didn't understand the central tenets of a free market capitalism. They did, right? But it was almost impossible because the governance of society at that time was very monarchist, feudalistic. You had all these governance, tyrannical governance, that made it almost impossible for free market capitalism to be fettered and to develop. And what happened is the Industrial Revolution, and this is what people miss, is that it's in the last 250 years is rarely where we've seen economic development. People forget that Sweden, that they use as an example, in 150 years ago, in fact 100 years ago, 150 years ago, was a poor nation. Its development, like most of Europe, rarely happened because of the Industrial Revolution. But could the Industrial Revolution have happened in an illiberal society? I don't think so. I think I've done a lot of talking.
Yeah, but so I like what you said, and I'm gonna insert myself in certain timelines. Okay. So if we go back to antiquity and we talk, there's a guy who's thinking on democracy I find quite persuasive, and that's Socrates. And so this is okay. I won't spend too much time on this because it's mostly philosophical, but I still think it's relevant and interesting, which is this idea that a democracy can only be accretive to a society if the individuals granted the right to vote actually understand the issues. Otherwise, what you'll have is a populist. And the example that he gave in his time was that, look, if you have two politicians standing in front of an audience, and one is telling you the truth that, you know what, you need to make difficult, painful changes to get the outcomes that you want in your life, right? And you have another one who's a charlatan who's saying, you know what, guys, don't listen to that other guy. He just wants to make you miserable. If you just take these sweets, all your problems are going to go away, right? If the audience is uninformed, they're obviously going to go for the guy offering them sweets instead of the guy who's offering them the cold, hard, difficult truth. So, and I don't think, especially when you think about democracy in an African context, I don't think we pay sufficient attention to Socrates' wisdom when we structure our constitutions and our democracies. Now, going fast forward,
it's also very necessary for us to be very clear that's more Plato, right?
Well, Socrates didn't write anything.
Yeah. So we need to make that distinction because Aristotle has a very different understanding of democracy from Platonian understanding of democracy.
So the one that I find most persuasive from antiquity, the one that resonates with me is Socrates. You are probably more
Aristotelian.
Yes, and I'm sure you can make the case for Aristotle much better than I can. But I just wanted to inject that view that it's not necessarily always a good idea to give everybody above a certain age these rights.
No, absolutely. But I think that what you're speaking to are the problems with democracy. Yeah. I think the first thing is let's espouse the tenets. Do you espouse the tenets? The way I've defined democracy. Do you think that's a good thing?
I'm just saying,
then we can talk about its pitfalls, and it has many pitfalls, and we can speak about those pitfalls
for sure.
Right.
So going fast forwarding to the Industrial Revolution, which is where Sweden and most of Europe basically, I think before the Industrial Revolution, 90% of the world's population lived in abject poverty.
99.
So
only kings lived in,
and the aristocrats,
yes,
right?
Exactly.
So basically, the Industrial Revolution moved the average European from abject poverty to what we call middle class. But so what happened to allow the Industrial Revolution to happen? Did Europe at that time have what we would think of as modern democracy. No, right? The people who had the power to vote during the Industrial Revolution were firstly men.
That's also not true. It was a vote by family.
It was the man who was head of the family
each family had a vote.
And you needed to own property to actually have a say, right? If you were a serf.
So, Rufaro, let's not get into the pitfalls. First, let's espouse. Do we agree? So, because you ask a very important thing, that during the Industrial Revolution, what started it? Is it democracy and liberal democracy as we understand it? Or it was just industrial revolution. It was just markets. Suddenly we had markets, and suddenly people became very innovative, and we had the industrial revolution.
So there was a confluence of things. There was a confluence of things.
So hear me out. We've got a continuum of 6,000 years, and you're talking about something that happened in the last 200 years, 250 if we want to be.
Yeah, 1760. That's when the industrial revolution started.
I want to chip in. Alfaro raised an interesting point, which I think maybe it actually speaks to more why we can't impose democracy on everyone. The issue to do with, so he's saying that maybe there's a need to have a society where the people that are participating in the democratic processes, they understand what is happening. Otherwise, it becomes populist. But democracy, by its nature, is populism. If you're saying because it's ruled by the majority anyway, and I don't think it's actually an African problem. It's not just an African problem. I think even in more developed countries, that's why we had Trump. The kind of message that he was actually articulating at his political gatherings, where you would ask yourself, is he actually speaking to the American audience who are supposed to be more knowledgeable and more exposed? But still...
Well, what are you saying? I'm actually a Trump supporter.
Yes.
You shouldn't say that out loud.
So his argument about making America again, great again, or trying to close the border, and his attitude towards immigrants and those kind of things, I think he was actually striking the populism chord. So, and it worked for him. So you can't actually separate democracy from actually populism. And at the moment you start to say, okay, no, let's move away from one man, one vote, to trying to weight the value of the vote on the basis of
knowledge.
Knowledge and society.
A trivial thing like knowledge.
Yes. But what it says is, actually, if you were to I would put these systems in some sort of a hierarchy. So a society that is less developed, less civilized, I don't think it makes sense for you to take them all the way to democracy.
To one man, one vote.
Exactly, because it's actually vulnerable to manipulation by politicians, which is what you are seeing in Africa.
Okay,
so I think you'd ask a question, what started? Was it democracy or industrial revolution? I think a scenario where there is economic development, like given the China example, they are not a democracy right now, but by uplifting all those people, 400 million out of abject poverty, you know what happens when you move into middle class? You start to have different aspirations and start demanding certain freedoms and etc. And I wouldn't be surprised. In fact, I would actually go a step further and say, if China continues on this growth trajectory and more people become more well-to-do, they'll start demanding a different kind of governance system. And suddenly there's no way that we can sustain autocracy in a society that is well off.
Okay, so I think that you're wrong on many grounds. First of all, there are many forms of democracy.
Okay.
And again, you guys tend to pick on what's problematic with democracy. And again, you're picking on a Plato idea that democracy is the worst form of governance. Okay, so I'm perfectly fine with that, right? And we can get into the details. But I think that let's not pick its pitfalls to begin with. Let's actually use it as an ideal. And there are many forms
So
of
give us an example of an ideal.
Okay.
Especially for a poor society.
All right, I'll
Where
get
is it
there.
worked? I mean, from a society that is...
Remember, America was a poor society. Remember, all these countries were poor societies 250 years ago.
Yes, but
None of
so
them
let's
were
talk about
rich
America.
at all.
So tell us about the founding fathers.
Yeah, and their form of democracy was a Republican. So you can, so the first thing, but there's a point I really want to make about populism, that all the tyrants in the world were populists. So let's not, let's not believe that only democracy can have tyrants of the majority.
Can have populists, you mean?
Populism, if you look at Julius Caesar, he was a populist. If you look at almost all tyrants, Mussolini, Hitler, Stalin, Mao, they're all populists. So let's not think that that is unique to democracy.
But they didn't
Right.
give people the right to choose their leader. So they're just populist to the extent of maybe...
And they were lying when they were being populist.
pushing agendas which they thought maybe would align with people's views, but not necessarily giving them an opportunity to choose their own leaders.
What we're saying is populism is not tied to just democracy. Populism is tied to power. Because remember, if you're not a populist, if you're a tyrant and you're not a populist, then you risk being overthrown.
You risk the French Revolution.
You risk the French Revolution. You risk all sorts of revolutions. So it's anyone in power has to have a bit of demagoguery. And I also don't think that there's anything wrong with populism. I think that there's something wrong with extreme populism. I don't think there's anything wrong with demagoguery. If you believe in the Greek society, the Athenians believed that demagoguery was an important part of leadership, right? Let's be very clear. The ability to articulate issues to the public is a very important thing. To the plebs or to whoever. It's a very important thing. That's how. In fact, that's what we're doing right on this show.
No.
In some level,
I beg to differ, but
we are appealing to
the audience,
to the public, and so I think that Athenian society had it right, and I think that the problem is the extreme form of populism that becomes quite problematic, and I think that the idea, especially with the American version of republicanism, the ability that you have tunnels where society, that you are. Even the judiciary system, where almost everyone has jury duty and is a participant in the making of laws. Because there must be a distinction between rule of might, which is a more Plato understanding, which is what you guys think is necessary.
I'm not a fan of rule of might.
Rule of might or rule of law. So the minute we say rule of law, it means that everyone must buy into the law. Right? Not just a few people who must buy into the law. Almost everybody in society must buy into that law. And I make the assertion that for the Industrial Revolution to happen is because to some extent, not to a great extent, but to some extent, power moved from the aristocracy and the monarch to the people. And when power moved to the people, then you could defend a particular right. Let me give you a very clear-cut example. For you guys as an entrepreneurs, it's the central tenet for an entrepreneur is that you will be protected by the law.
If you have a commercial dispute.
For whatever, even your ideas, your money, whatever you're doing, you want the protection of the law. And if you don't have protection of the law and it's ruled by might, where will you get that protection from?
So, Tinashe, are you saying in a undemocratic society, they don't have laws? So it's actually possible to have even whether it's a monarchy or take the example of the Middle East. Probably they use the Sharia law. That's some form of law that they have. But I think what has been lacking is the consistency to whatever you believe in. So if you could have some sort of consistent law, even in an undemocratic society, even the businesses will still thrive.
Ranga,
because
what's the first thing that a tyrant does when they take over power? What's the first thing that Julius Caesar does when he takes over power? He suspends the law. He suspends.
Yeah, what
the
happened to
Constitution.
Julius Caesar? I don't think he's such a great example.
That's what every tyrant does. That's what rule of might is all about. Rule of might means rule.
No,
by.
but Ranga actually made a very valid point, and I want to take you back and push back on something that you said about the Industrial Revolution in particular, which is, the capital formation that happened was in the context of a framework where you had rule of law, but that wasn't because the aristocracy and the monarchy wanted to please the plebs. Right, I don't know how much you know about the Magna Carta and the history of that. That had nothing to do with the masses, right? That was just the elites amongst themselves being frustrated with a king who used to just molest them at his whims and caprices, right? And they said, no. Actually, you know what? If you want to punish any of us, you're the king. You actually have to have a good reason. And they went to war, and they had the settlement where there had to be due process. If the king had a problem with a duke or an earl or somebody in the aristocracy, he had to go through this due process to demonstrate that that person actually did something wrong before he could punish them. And that's what the capitalists relied on, that rule of law. It wasn't something that was sold to the masses. It was an understanding amongst the elites.
So I actually agree with you, and I don't know where we're missing each other, because if you look at the Magna Carta, right, that's 13th century or 12th century England. What's clear is it tells us the story or the movie of democracy, that it's an evolutionary process, that we're moving away from pure rule of might to some rule of law, albeit the aristocratic rights which were defended and not the plebs. I totally agree with that. But by the time you get to 500 years later, what are you starting to have? Parliamentary democracy in the UK. And I think that parliamentary democracy in the UK is precisely what started the Industrial Revolution. And I think that the migration to America, which promised people their rights, right? That, okay, over in Europe, you don't have any rights. But if you come over here, you have some level of rights, not all rights, right? And the right to income, the right to actually negotiate your income was a fundamental one. But the right to land, you couldn't own, if you were part of the plebs, you couldn't own the land in Europe. But the minute you went to the new society, which was the US, suddenly you could own land. Which right, hitherto, you never had. And I make the assertion that democracy is evolutionary, that the minute it made it possible for the greater majority of people, or maybe not, let's not say majority, but let's say a great number of people to have some level of rights and some level of protection of their property. That's when you started seeing the great civilization of the 18th century. That's the assertion I'm making.
Yeah, but the democracy that was alive and well in the 18th century at the peak of the Industrial Revolution, it was not an all-inclusive democracy. It was a democracy of elites. So in the US, if you look at 18th century America and you look at the Declaration of Independence, it's got all this flowery language. But the people who could vote after the American Revolution were men who owned property. Nobody else had the right. And they created a society that looked out for their interests. If you were black and you were a slave, you had no rights whatsoever. And so it's not. So I want to separate the romantic ideal of one man, one vote to a system with checks and balances where somebody can't take power and then just be completely destructive to that society.
But that's exactly what we say, that one man, one vote is just part of a democracy. It's not the all-in a democracy.
But is it not the central part?
It's actually not. It's actually not. In fact, America...
It's less than ideal. That's the point I'm making. I'll go further and say it's less than ideal.
America doesn't have one man, one vote. Most of Europe doesn't have the majoritarian. It's proportional representation, right? Most societies don't have that. Most society is proportional, is republicanism. If you remember the electoral states in the US, that certain states have greater say than other states. There are all those checks and balances. But you can only have those checks and balances if you're under rule of law, not under rule of might. So
maybe to distill what the counterpoint that Ranga and I might be proposing is that the ideal is not necessarily a society that's democratic. The ideal is a society that respects rule of law.
It's almost impossible for a society to respect rule of law if it is a non-democratic state. I'm saying it's almost impossible because you're saying you have a liberal society. What's the opposite of a liberal society?
An illiberal
society. An illiberal society, the central tenet of an illiberal society is suspension of the rule of law.
So I actually think
you're the lawyer.
I actually think the more so
let's hear your views.
Okay. I actually think when you look at the rule of law and what Rufaro was actually articulating, those are, I think historically or even you'd see that it's actually the owners of capital, of forms of production that actually have got an influence in any kind of law-setting environment. So it's actually more to do with the development of capitalism as opposed to democratic processes. Because what you constitute actually rule of law in any society is basically what the owners of capital in that society actually are pushing for. Because in a democratic society in that sense, it means someone who has got access to capital also has got power and influence to affect and influence the democracy of the environment. So I think the major development that has really changed, revolutionized the world has not been democracy, but more capitalism.
Cheers to that, Ranga.
Yeah. Because any kind of law in any society is actually driven mostly by the capitalists. They've got influence on the politicians, and it can be direct or indirectly. There's a big thing.
So can I ask you something,
yes.
Ranga? Because you've said a lot of things, and I think you've articulated some things that I agree with and some that I vehemently disagree with. Why was it impossible for capitalism to thrive before 250 years ago? So why didn't capitalism thrive in 2,000 years ago? 3,000 years ago, a man called Hesiod, if you know him, talked about scarcity, talked about how sheep prices, change because of the seasons. During winter, when you have less and less of sheep, the price seems to go up, and during summer, the price comes down. All the principles that we know of capitalism, prior society, Athenian, Roman society, knew all those things. Do not think that you're clever. You are not clever at all. Egyptian society, African society, knew all those tenets.
And it had wealthy people and it had poor people. So capitalism existed.
No, it did not exist. Capitalism is mass production to the masses. It did not exist until 250 years ago. But the tenets of the market, understanding markets, certainly Thomas of Aquinas knew those tenets. Most people in Athenian society knew those tenets, and yet capitalism did not thrive. Similarly, let me give you a very good example, a contemporary example. Us, the three of us, know everything that must be done in a capitalist society and what the Zimbabwean state must do. We all know what they must do, but it's just not happening, right? Does it mean that we're ignorant?
No.
Right.
Okay, that's a different discussion. But anyway, okay. But I'll answer the question you're posing to Ranga.
I'll give you the opportunity to do so. So Ranga, let me reiterate the question again. The question is this: earlier societies understood the fundamentals of what a market society should have. And yet, they did not thrive. Why did they thrive 250 years ago?
I think I'll still make an argument that it's more capitalism, because look, fine, they understood how the market.
So okay, why did capitalism happen 250 years ago and not 2,000 years ago?
Capitalism. It's not capitalism that happened 250 years ago. It's the Industrial Revolution. I think you're conflating the two. And the Industrial Revolution, one of the reasons that...
What's the Industrial Revolution if not capitalism? Remember, we moved from a feudalistic state to a capitalistic state.
So it's a revolution, right? That it's in the word revolution. Like, it was so dramatic. It was at such a scale.
And we're moving from what to what?
It was overwhelming, right? And society moved from being predominantly agrarian, right, to being industrial, to having factories for the first time.
Why?
Right. So I would say that it's a confluence of things. So James Watt invented the steam engine, right? That was an important component of it. The other component of it is that
it was not the first invention.
Yes, but okay. So okay, I'm just going to put it on the table, and we can go into the weeds if you like.
Yeah. No,
so
I
think there's a bunch of it's a confluence of a bunch of things that made the Industrial Revolution possible. So I'm going to. First, one aspect was technological, which is why I'm mentioning James Watt's steam engine. The other was the legal framework, which is that for the first time you had limited liability companies, right?
That was in the US and not
in the UK.
In the UK.
That was in the UK because before the Industrial Revolution, just for the for the purposes of the audience to understand what I mean by limited liability companies. If Ranga, Tinashe, and I entered into a commercial enterprise and we borrowed a bunch of money from George in Nairobi, right? And then we failed miserably to run our enterprise and we owed George a whole bunch of money. George had the right to sue us individually for everything that we owned personally, right? So if you were this change, were liable in your personal capacity for all that company's debts if it failed. So limited liability now said if the three of us put $100 each into an endeavor, and then we went and got $1,000 from George, and then the thing failed, right?
So George I will excuse you because I suspect you didn't study company law. But I'm not going to excuse you because company law has been with us since 12-something. Yeah, but limited liability did not start the... So what I thought you were going to talk about, the UK had limited liability,
but it went in vogue. It went like it was supercharged during the Industrial Revolution.
What happened, or the critical thing that happened with the Industrial Revolution, is certainly your invention. So before the Industrial Revolution, all intellectual rights were owned by the monarch. But during the Industrial Revolution, suddenly somebody could actually own
the intellectual
property. That was impossible. With rule of might, you don't own any intellectual property. Whereas suddenly, and especially America, and this happened in America more so than in Europe, because suddenly you could own the right. You had property rights. And property rights are an important tenet of the market system. But you can't have property rights if you don't have democracy. Because all these other institutions that we're talking about, the protection of rights.
No, people owned property before democracy, surely.
Very few people.
So actually...
In fact, the land was owned by the monarch.
Tinashe, I think you're actually making our argument that it took the private ownership of property in a society for us to have this democracy you're talking about, because someone who was owning a means of production, you've done very well, you start worrying about your neighbor, you start worrying about the monarchy and the whoever is in control, and like, okay, fine, what do I get as some sort of for me to be protected? Because I can't keep on creating value in a system where that value can be just taken away. So it's actually more capitalism that is actually, in my view, that you want to have...
That caused democracy to happen.
That you would rather have a situation where you allow capitalism to thrive, more people get out of poverty, they are inventing, they are owning things, and those people now are like, okay, fine, this is where we are, but we now need the protection of the law.
Okay,
right?
so I think this is where I side with Rufaro. That first of all, that's the road, the democratic evolution. The democratic evolution is we're democratizing the concentration of power from one end. So if it's a spectrum, the democratic evolution was there's this tyrant or monarch,
the king, the emperor,
whoever, right? There's high concentration of power. And what we're doing, is we're democratizing that process from that end to a full-on spectrum where it eventually ends up...
Where the village idiot can vote.
I think that's a misnomer. Remember what we talked about?
Who drives that process, Tinashe? Who drives that process? Is it the common man or is the aristocrat? Because
first of all, remember the people who are closer to the emperor or the king are the aristocrat. And after the aristocrat, it then has to move down because the inventions are not actually coming from the aristocrat. In fact, inventions and innovation, more likely than not, come from poor people. The whole entire reason why people moved from Europe, they were not the aristocrat. The aristocrat doesn't migrate. The aristocrat stayed in Europe. As far as they were concerned, their rights were already protected. So they didn't need to move. But the people who actually moved from Europe to America were poor people. But suddenly they went into a society where they could actually own land. Because they couldn't own land in Europe. They could own intellectual property. They could become entrepreneurs. So that's the evolution of democratizing this thing called power from the emperor and the king right through to the village idiot. And the village idiot, the central tenet of democracy, the village idiot must be able to own property. That's the central tenet of capitalism and democracy. Is that it's almost impossible for the village idiot.
But are we not able to separate capitalism from democracy?
No, we can. And I make the assertion that when you look at China, and I think this then can close.
Is there a causal relationship between those two?
Yes, I was going to make this because I think we need to move on. But I was going to make this argument that when you look at the full tenets of democracy, there are many components of it. So if you look at what China has done, China has just not allowed one component of democracy, which is the voting, which is, I think, something that you guys don't like. But I think the mistake that you're making is to believe that democracy is really centered around the voting. It's just one element. But things like rule of law, you might actually turn to find that China might have better laws and better rule of law than a lot of African countries, than a lot of Western countries. The right for property, the right for labor, the free movement of labor. I think China is way ahead than most Western societies.
Well, it's certainly not a nanny state that doesn't allow people to work as hard as they would like.
Precisely. And all those are tenets of democracy. Those tenets are not coming from outside of democracy, right? If we might mistake and believe that China, just because they don't have the electoral component of democracy, that it is a non-democratic state. We're not civic organizations, right? But if you look at the components that you want, that if you are going to invest in China, that you can get your money out, that you can go to their courts and you will be protected, right? And that the president will not interfere with your rights. Just that on its own is democratic because you're moving away from concentration of power because it's got nothing to do. But does it mean that they're all out democratic state? No. And I think that that's part of the problem.
I love what you're saying, and I think that's particularly relevant for Africa in general and countries like Zimbabwe in particular, because our conundrum primarily is that we're poor, and we need to get out of poverty. We actually need to create wealth, and we need to create a framework that allows us to grow our economy at a rapid clip over a sustained period of time. And so when I look at the continent, and I suspect that we have this very romantic ideal that we aspire to when it comes to democracy that's actually not married to the economic outcomes that we're looking for. I think a lot of people on the continent would give up a lot of what people in the West would deem very important freedoms if they were guaranteed emancipation from poverty.
But the only way you can do that is through democratizing the power. If you have concentration of power, it's almost impossible. Then you have an emperor like Julius Caesar. And
I quite like Julius Caesar, by the way.
Well, he quite ruined Rome. Because you remember you had 700 years of a republican Rome that actually developed.
So, Tinashe,
and Julius Caesar was the worst thing that could have ever happened to Rome.
So, are you making the point that the system that we have in China is pseudo-democratic in a way because of certain rights that they've given, especially around property rights?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
But I think it's more capitalism again. So I would make the case that look, it's I think what you're talking about, it speaks more to capitalism, and the fact that when you allow private property rights and other things to thrive, you are able to actually improve the economic situation of everyone. And it is only when people are at a certain level economically that they will start pushing for the other tenets of democracy.
It's evolutionary.
Yes,
I don't think 100 years from now China will be the state it's in. But certainly the China today is not the China under Mao.
So does it make sense?
What has happened between the China under Mao and now is because power has been democratized.
So does it? So in that case, isn't it which one of the two models makes the most sense? The Chinese model, where they've actually started off with economic rights, actually giving their citizens more economic rights before they jumped to the right to vote, versus what we have, especially in the African context, where we just said, okay, there's democracy, one man, one vote, but you are looking at the population that's impoverished, and it's actually that can be manipulated by the politicians.
I think it's the way you're looking at it. I think that the right to vote is just one component of democracy. It's one component. So I think that the problem we have in Africa is we hear the word democracy and we immediately think it's about voting. It's about election cycles. And I think that's the problem, because we haven't fully espoused the idea. The idea of democracy is power moves from a center, from an emperor or king, or a tyrant or a dictator, and it's dispersed. Now, I totally agree with you that that process is evolutionary, just like it was under America, that it evolves. But you cannot start to think that the founding fathers didn't believe in democracy. Because the problem with Africa is we actually don't believe in democracy. Whereas the founding fathers were actually very clear about what they wanted to do, but they were also very realistic. So it's not just, so they had the idealism, and usually it's the left side of our brain that is the idealism, and the right side of our brain is now supposed to be the reality. And the reality they understood was, for us to reach the ideal, it's going to be an evolutionary process. I think they were clear about that. But they were also very clear about the ideal. The problem with Africa is we do not even understand the ideal.
It was imposed on us. That's why
are you saying that pre-colonial? Are you saying pre-colonial state was not democratic?
Of course it wasn't democratic.
It wasn't. Are you saying Rhodesia was democratic?
I said pre-colonial.
Oh, okay.
I said
no.
pre-colonial state.
No, it wasn't. Because remember, these were like
Oh my
We
God.
are chiefs and kings.
Yeah.
How was that a democracy?
you know.
So let me even make it very clear. Pre-colonial state, we had what we termed consensus management. In fact, our
I
families...
got him that Indian.
I got him that. Remember, we're not talking about the full-blown democracy. We're saying, did we have certain tenets of democracy? And I'm saying that even in our families, you can't do anything alone. You can't go... Almost everything you do has to go kudari, has to go to the family members. The family must decide. That's more consensual management, consensual.
But that's
consensus.
that's not democracy.
No, remember what I said about democracy. Democracy is power moving away from one center. As long as power moves away from one center. And if you think about it, pre-colonial, so what we were then termed by the colonialists as one group. But pre-colonial, we had many tribes, many clans, right? And in those, it actually allowed us. If you're Kutuzo Nzishumba, it's because you broke away from someone else, because you disagreed with that particular person. And we had a method of reconciliation where we actually said, okay,
Some people didn't survive that reconciliation.
perfect. No. I'm not saying anything was perfect, but I'm just saying that actually we had a more democratic state than Western nations. If you look at our pre-colonial, what actually then happened is we took away the democratic state to the extent that it was democratic for that period. And we imposed a colonial state which was undemocratic, which was illiberal, right? And I think that that's our version of democracy is purely predicated on
So let me ask you a
the
question.
colonial
So
state.
I agree with what you've said so far, and I'm curious. If you had a blank piece of paper, right? If you were anointed the emperor for the next 5 years,
I would have a problem with being anointed the emperor. And that's why I am wearing mine. I do not want to be an emperor. I go, because I'm a libertarian, so I actually literally go against the idea and the notion
Okay, so let me frame it differently.
being an emperor.
Let me frame it differently. If you had an amenable audience, right, to hear your libertarian vision for Zimbabwe, and you had a blank piece of paper, and you had to present to the audience, guys, this is what I think is ideal for Zimbabwe. You know, you've got a spectrum of extreme tyranny, an emperor king on one end, you have the madness of one man, one vote on the other. What ideal would you present?
Okay, so I would present the two, that you have the right and the left brain. And that the first thing is for us to have the ideal and to be very clear about how pristine and good the ideal is. And pristine and good is a society where every individual has their full-on rights, where their rights are protected, where you have full-on private property and choice. But being aware that this is the ideal, and I would show people why the ideal is necessary, because actually their own welfare really is incumbent upon the ideal being what we aim for. But being realistic is, how do we move from where we are now through an evolutionary process to get to the ideal? But I would not reject the ideal. In fact, what we need to do in Africa is to write about the ideal. We have stopped being romantic about the ideal. Society, the Enlightenment is purely an embedding of the romantic, the idea of what Africa could be. And I think that if we hold the ideal of what Africa could be, then we can start talking about where we are
And how to get there.
The evolutionary process. So I would not be too demanding of certain things, but there are certain principles like right of property, right? Those are some of the things that I would very much push for, unless the electoral process, which you guys seem to have a problem with
Look.
voting. And I think those are open to discussion. The producer is jumping up and down.
Well, the producer is right there.
So we need to talk about doing business in Zim. Ranga, you have looked at these numbers. We've shared these numbers before. When you look at Zim, it turns out that Zim is one of the highest taxed countries in Africa. And in the world, we're in the top 20 in terms of tax. And we want to invite people to invest. I'm going to allow you to do a lot of talking around what we need to do as a country from a capitalist perspective. Less to do with democracy, but from a capitalist perspective where this is happening.
So, thanks, Nasha. You have mentioned the issue of tax. So, yeah, we are one of the highest taxed economies, but I think more than that, I think one of our biggest problems is actually corruption. So you add to the taxation and other things, corruption. So it's actually a big issue. Just think maybe for 30 seconds, just think of any public institution today that you could walk into looking for a service and you hope to get out being served without having to pay anything. So, the issue has actually become so perverse. I remember there was a time when, was it President Thabo Mbeki, who mentioned that, I don't know, it was him.
Gold investors from Ghana
coming to Zim, and they were asked to pay something. And there's also this rumor about, I don't know how far true it is, about this guy from Nigeria, the billionaire, who came to Zim to look for opportunities. And maybe at a micro level, even some of the people that we also interact with, and even just running businesses, entrepreneurs, whenever you are interacting with a regulator, the level of taxation actually goes beyond what you see on paper. So I'm happy to pay a non-tax that is, it's high, and I know this is all I have to pay. What I'm not happy to do, which is what we are doing on a daily basis, is there's an extra layer of tax from a regulator where if you want to try and do something right, just a simple thing, just try to regularize your things with Zimra. And you know how much money you'll have to pay.
So you're saying over and above our high taxes?
Yes.
And Zimbabwe is one of the highest taxed nations.
There's a huge
corruption tax.
Exactly. It's unbelievable.
Would you tend to agree with that?
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. I think it's a function of the extent to which the formal sector has shrunk. So it's particularly inefficient because it doesn't get the volume and funding that it should. If the entire economy was formal, right, instead of just 24% of it, because the percentage of our economy that's some dollar based is actually the formal economy. So it's a very small section of the economy. So the moment you walk into the door to interface with the government institution that's there to issue a license or some other kind of regulatory paperwork, they know that you don't have a choice. You don't have an option, right? You are
so
desperate.
How much of it is the informalization caused by the high taxes? Like if we had lower taxes, don't you think that will be?
So the two are married, because if you make it incredibly hard to do business through formal sectors. So take for example this thing that I piqued my interest on social media around. So there's this new free trade agreement across the continent, and one of the things that the body is looking to propose is to ban mabero, sales of second-hand clothing, right? So you'll ask the obvious question, which is, why are Africans interested in buying second-hand clothing in the first instance? Right? Why wouldn't they, like most people everywhere else in the world, want to walk into a shop and buy brand new articles of clothing? You know, why is this industry there and thriving if there's an alternative that's affordable and accessible. Yeah? And the answer is that the alternative actually isn't affordable and accessible. And many people have no choice but to buy from Mabero, but to buy secondhand clothing, right? And I think that's and I think that's a good metaphor for the informal sector. The informal sector exists to the extent that the formal sector isn't actually performing for those people, and they have no choice.
That's true. Okay. So tax is an important thing. Then we look at the other tax, and here someone has shared what Thomas Sowell has said about this. It says one of the biggest tax is that which is not even called a tax. It's called inflation. When the government spends money that it creates, it is transferring part of the value of your money to themselves. So we've got
like Zimbabwe.
so we've got high tax, and then on top of high tax, we've got corruption tax. Then top of corruption tax, we've got inflation tax.
Which explains why the Zim dollar is dying. Why most people would rather just trade in US dollars. Because US dollar informal sector doesn't have that inflation challenge.
Can we make this an important agenda, especially during the election season, that whoever is in power for the next 5 years, that they seriously think about tax and inflation tax, corruption tax, and actual tax in Zimbabwe? What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's important. Yeah, so government tax is a form of revenue for any government, so that's okay. But I think the level of taxation, it has to be one where it will still allow businesses, households, and individuals to still thrive, to do what they have to do with that extra layer. And, you know, like, because as an economy, as a country, we're actually competing with the rest of the globe for capital. So I think those are some of the issues that investors are looking at, your level of taxation, but also not only that, but the consistency in your taxation. So this thing that whenever government overspends or they've got this thing that they really want, they just resort to taxing, like what happened with the IMTT tax.
Yes.
That's
Instead
not,
of cutting expenditure.
Exactly. Instead of cutting expenditure, then you just invent some tax. And when you've invented and you don't have maybe you can't invent anymore, you just increase the level of taxation. I think that's not the way to go. So we need to have an environment where the tax regimes are such that they don't impede businesses and entrepreneurs. Unfortunately, in the Zim setup, that is what we have. The way, but because obviously when the economy is shrinking, the tax base is also shrinking.
Yeah.
And the people who are making policies, they don't accept reality that the tax base, the revenue is shrinking because the economy is shrinking. So maybe we need to do something either to boost economic growth, or maybe cut down on our expenses. They will still come asking for more tax and penalties and that kind of thing. It really makes it very, very unattractive as a destination. So there's that, and then the inconsistency that we have, especially in the policy environment, where today you're announcing, no, we are using this currency, and then tomorrow there's another currency. And you know, whenever we can't make sense of, in fact, we can't resolve or solve problems that we have created, we resort to some unorthodox way of.
Yeah.
Okay. So that all those factors actually makes Zim very, very unattractive. I don't know where we get this thing that we have got these resources and the world is dying to have them. The resources are good. And yes, they have got a value, but also the environment has to be conducive so that whichever investor, they'll be able to extract and still be able to make money and be able to ship it out if they so wish. So you can't invite people to come to Zimbabwe when you know that when they decide to take their dividends or part of their capital out, they are stuck.
There you have it, ladies and gentlemen. The purpose of this discussion was first to show what democracy means, and we took a rabbit hole where we went all sorts of places, China and Athens and everywhere. And we asked the question, is it a necessary and sufficient condition for economic growth? We seem to disagree there. But one thing that we actually do agree on is around capitalism and what we need for capitalism to work. So this is going to be a series of things that we're going to talk about, especially during this election season. One thing that we really want to talk about is the tax. That Zimbabwe already nominally has one of the highest taxes in the world. Then you have these added corruption tax, inflation tax, and we cannot be a capitalist society, or we cannot have economic development with all these taxes. In fact, from what we've gathered here, it's part of the problem that we need to solve. So during this election season, I hope that we take this as a matter that the political parties need to discuss quite seriously. And hopefully, the next 5 years, tax and reduction of taxes is something that we will be on the agenda. Let's hear your thoughts. Do you think democracy is a necessary and sufficient condition for economic development? Do you think our taxes could be reduced? Please share widely your thoughts.
And what does this rapper remind you of?
Of T-Rex.
Otherwise, have yourself a wonderful weekend. Cheers.